I worked 2 jobs for years to pay for my son's private education. But on his graduation day, my ex-wife had me removed by security so her new boyfriend could take my seat. She thought she'd won, but she forgot one thing. I was the anonymous benefactor funding her upcoming dream wedding. By the time the ceremony starts, the venue will be empty and the checks will be canceled. I stood in the dusty parking lot of the university, listening to the muffled sound of the brass band playing the graduation march inside. My hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the pure, cold shock of what had just happened. I looked down at my reflection in the window of my old work truck. I was wearing a suit that felt tight around my shoulders, a suit I had bought specifically for this day, the proudest day of my life. But instead of sitting in the front row watching my son, Leo, walk across that stage, I was standing next to a dumpster because 2 security guards had physically escorted me out of the building. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear. The betrayal didn't start today, though. It started years ago when my ex-wife, Sarah, decided that a man who worked with his hands wasn't prestigious enough for the life she wanted to live. We had been high school sweethearts, but as I built my logistics business from 1 van to a fleet of 30, she grew ashamed of the grease under my fingernails and the long hours I spent on the road. She wanted the galas, the wine tastings, and the friends who spoke in hushed tones about their summer homes. When she left me, she took half of everything, but I didn't care. I told her she could have the house and the money, as long as Leo got the best education possible. For the next 10 years, I became a ghost in my own son's life. Sarah told Leo that I was too busy with work to come to his soccer games or his award ceremonies. In reality, I was working 16-hour days, running my company by day, and taking on high-level consulting gigs at night. Every single penny of that extra income went into a trust fund for Leo. I paid for the $40,000 a year private high school. I paid for the Ivy League tuition. I paid for the summer internships in Europe. But because I sent the money through a blind trust to keep things drama-free, Sarah convinced Leo that she was the one making it all happen through her smart investments. Then came Julian. Julian was everything Sarah ever wanted, a venture capitalist who wore $3,000 loafers and talked about disrupting markets. He slid into my son's life, playing the role of the sophisticated mentor. He took the credit for the opportunities my money bought. And today, at the graduation ceremony I had dreamed about for 2 decades, Sarah saw her chance to finally erase me. When I tried to take my seat, she pointed me out to the head of security, whispering that I was an unstable ex who was there to cause a scene. Julian sat in my chair, his arm around my son's shoulders, looking like the proud father I was supposed to be. As I sat in my truck, the anger started to settle into something much more dangerous. A plan? You see, Sarah had been bragging on social media for months about her upcoming wedding of the century. She was marrying Julian at the Blackwood Estate, a massive, historic mansion that cost 6 figures just to rent for a weekend. She told everyone that a prestigious international foundation had recognized her charity work and offered to sponsor the entire wedding as a gift. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the Blackwood Foundation was a shell company I had set up years ago to manage my real estate holdings. I didn't just fund the wedding. I owned the very ground she was planning to walk on. For months, I had been approving her requests for imported lilies, vintage champagne, and a 40-piece orchestra. I had watched her spend my money on a dream life built on a foundation of lies. I put my truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. I wasn't going to call Leo. I wasn't going to argue with Sarah. I was going to let them have their moment of victory today. I wanted them to feel on top of the world. I wanted Sarah to feel like she had finally won. Because the higher you climb, the harder you hit the ground when the floor disappears. I spent the next 48 hours in my office, surrounded by legal documents and bank ledgers. My lawyer, a man who had seen me grind since the early days, looked at the papers I wanted him to file. "Mark," he said, "this is a total scorched earth policy. You realize once you do this, there's no going back? You'll be the villain in her story forever." I looked at the photo on my desk of Leo when he was 5 years old, holding a toy truck I had bought him. "I've been the villain in her story for 10 years, Bill." I replied. "It's time I started playing the part." I started with the venue. As the primary stakeholder of the company that held the mortgage on Blackwood Estate, I noticed a very specific clause in the rental agreement regarding moral turpitude and character of the lessees. I signed the paperwork to trigger an immediate foreclosure based on a series of unpaid municipal taxes I had intentionally let slide for this exact moment. By Friday morning, the estate would legally be a restricted zone. Next, I moved to the vendors. I had been paying them through the foundation's accounts. I didn't just cancel the checks. I sent formal notices that the foundation was dissolving effective immediately due to an internal investigation into fraudulent applications. The caterers, the decorators, the musicians, they all received a notification that their payments were being clawed back. But the final move was the most personal. I knew Sarah had been using Leo's new job at a top-tier law firm, a job he got through a recommendation from one of my silent business partners, to brag to her friends. I made one phone call to that partner. I didn't ask him to fire Leo. I just asked him to send Leo a file. A file containing 10 years of bank transfers, school tuition receipts, and the original trust fund documents, all signed by me. The wedding was less than 24 hours away. Sarah was likely at the estate right now, sipping mimosas and getting her hair done, thinking she had finally reached the pinnacle of society. She had no idea that the walls were already closing in. She had no idea that the ghost she tried to kick out of the room was about to haunt her entire life. The night before the wedding, the Blackwood Estate looked like a fairy tale. Thousands of fairy lights were strung through the ancient oak trees, and the air smelled of expensive lilies and salt from the nearby ocean. Inside the bridal suite, Sarah was glowing. She sat in front of a massive gold-framed mirror, sipping champagne while a team of 3 people worked on her hair and makeup. She felt like she had finally made it. She was marrying a man who looked good on camera. She was the talk of the town. And most importantly, she had finally cut the last low-class tie to her past. She had told Leo that his father was too embarrassed to show up at the wedding, and Leo, still riding the high of his graduation, had simply nodded. He was moving into a world of mansions and private clubs, and in that world, a man who smelled like diesel and sawdust didn't fit. While Sarah was dreaming of her grand entrance, Leo was sitting in his new apartment, staring at his laptop. He had received an encrypted file from the senior partner at his law firm. The subject line simply said, "Full disclosure, the foundation of your future." He clicked it open, expecting a congratulatory note or a new case file. Instead, he found a spreadsheet. It was a line-by-line breakdown of every tuition payment made to his elementary school, his high school, and his university. Next to every payment was a scan of a check. They weren't signed by Sarah. They weren't from a smart investment fund. Every single one was signed by me, Mark, using the account of a small logistics company. He scrolled further and found the Blackwood Foundation documents. He saw the owner's name. He saw my name. The apartment felt like it was spinning. Everything he thought he knew about his mother's wealth and his father's absence was a lie. He realized that while Julian was taking him to fancy dinners, I was working the night shift to pay for the very chair Julian was sitting in. The sun rose on Saturday morning, and the chaos began at exactly 8 a.m. Sarah was woken up not by the soft music she had requested, but by the sound of shouting downstairs. She threw on her silk robe and ran to the balcony. Below, she saw the florist trucks being loaded back up. The massive floral arches that cost more than a mid-sized car were being dismantled. She ran down the stairs, her voice high and panicked. "What are you doing? The ceremony is in 5 hours." The head florist looked at her with a cold, professional expression. "The Blackwood Foundation just issued a stop payment on all checks. Our contract states that if payment isn't cleared 24 hours prior, we pull the stock. I'm sorry, but we're moving these to a corporate event in the city." Sarah tried to call Julian, but he didn't pick up. She tried to call the foundation representative, but the number was disconnected. 10 minutes later, the catering manager arrived. He didn't even wait for her to speak. "We're leaving, Mrs. Miller, or soon to be Mrs. Whatever. The wine, the steak, the staff, it's all being packed up. No payment, no party." By noon, the estate was a skeleton. The music stands were empty, the tables were bare, and the 50-pound wedding cake was being wheeled out by a baker who looked like he wanted to spit on the floor. Sarah was losing her mind. She found Julian in the library, pacing back and forth. He looked different without his smug smile. He looked small. "Julian, do something. Call your bank. Use your venture capital fund." Julian turned to her, his face pale. "Sarah, you don't understand. My fund is tied up in long-term assets. I don't have $500,000 in cash to drop on a wedding today. I thought the foundation was handling it." The truth was finally out. Julian was a broke social climber who was betting on Sarah's supposed wealth just as much as she was betting on his. They were two leeches trying to feed off each other, only to realize the host had finally pulled the plug. At 1 p.m., a black SUV pulled up to the gates. It wasn't the guests. It was a man in a plain suit with a badge. He served Sarah and Julian with an emergency evacuation order. "This property has been flagged for immediate tax, seizure, and structural safety violations. The owner has ordered all occupants to leave the premises by 2 p.m. Sarah screamed that she was the guest of honor, that this was her day, but the officer didn't care. He told her she could leave on her own or be removed in handcuffs. I pulled my work truck up to the edge of the estate at 1:45 p.m. I wasn't wearing a suit today. I was wearing my work boots and a faded t-shirt. I stood by the gate and watched as Sarah stumbled out onto the gravel driveway. Her hair was a mess. Her expensive dress was dragging in the dirt, and she was clutching her shoes in one hand. Julian was trailing behind her, carrying a suitcase, looking like a defeated dog. She saw my truck and stopped dead in her tracks. The rage in her eyes was enough to burn the forest down. "Ew," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You ruined everything. You did this on purpose. You let me get this far just to humiliate me." I stepped out of the truck and leaned against the door. I looked at the massive, empty mansion behind her. "I didn't ruin anything, Sarah. I just stopped paying for the lie. You wanted a prestigious life? You wanted a man who didn't get his hands dirty? Well, here he is. He's all yours. I hope he can pay for your taxi home, because the limo company just called me to say their payment was canceled too." Julian tried to step forward, trying to salvage some shred of his ego. "Listen, Mark, we can talk about this. This is unprofessional. Think about Leo. I didn't even look at him. I looked past them at the car pulling up behind them. It was Leo. He stepped out of the car, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't look at me with pity or embarrassment. He looked at me with a profound, painful sense of clarity. He walked past his mother, ignoring her cries for help, and stood right in front of me. He held up the file I'd sent him. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" His voice was quiet, thick with emotion. "Why did you let her tell me those things about you?" "Because I wanted you to have a life without the weight of our war," I told him. "I didn't care if you loved me, Leo. I just wanted you to have a chances I never had. But when she took my seat at your graduation, When you try to give your future to a man who didn't earn a single second of it. That was where I drew the line. Leo turned to his mother. She started to ramble, trying to blame me, trying to say it was all a big misunderstanding. Leo just held up his hand. I saw the checks, Mom. I saw the dates. Every time you told me Dad was too busy to see me, he was working a double shift to pay for my books. Every time Julian sponsored a trip, it was Dad's company account that cleared the funds. You didn't just lie to me. You stole my father from me for 10 years. Leo turned back to me and did something he hadn't done since he was a little boy. He hugged me. Right there on the driveway of the estate I was about to lock up, he told me he was sorry. He told me he was coming home. I looked over his shoulder at Sarah and Julian. They were standing in the dust of their own greed, alone and broke. The wedding of the century was over before it started, and the ghost benefactor was finally stepping into the light. Sarah is currently trying to sue me, but every lawyer she talks to laughs when they see the contract she signed. She's living in a small apartment Julian can't afford, and her socialite friends won't even return her texts. As for me and Leo, we're rebuilding. I'm teaching him how to run the logistics firm, the real way, with hard work and honesty. He's finally learning that a man isn't defined by the suit he wears, but by the promises he keeps and the foundations he builds. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear.